Hello, welcome back. We're back. You're back. I'm back. We're both back. And we're chatting about running. Appreciate you being here. My name's Tommy, if you didn't know already. Although you might know, because this is part 2 of a 2-part episode on how to train for a marathon. So if you're coming in here for the first time and you haven't listened to part 1, I'd recommend it. It'll make a lot more sense. But if you're here having returned, having listened to part 1 and you want part 2, here we are, we're doing it. If you're out there running right now, if you're enjoying the pavement or the trails, well done. You're out there, you're working on yourself, you're doing something worthwhile, and that's a good thing. So, this episode, we're talking about how to follow your training plan. It's not always easy. Last episode, we talked about how to build it, how to write it. We went over a lot. It was a dense episode full of information, maybe something you can return to at some point. But hopefully that gave you a good overview on the sorts of things you should be thinking about when building a training plan and what sort of stuff goes into it. This episode, we're talking about following that training plan, the dreaded execution. So what does that look like? Well, we're going to be covering off what does good execution look like, how to adapt your training plan. Most of this episode will be dedicated to all the different possible scenarios that could pose challenges on you following that training plan and how to adapt your training plan appropriately. Then we'll just go through dealing with setbacks, some mindset tips, how to show up consistently, and I've got a few attitudes to maintain for you too. And then we'll do our best attempt at summarizing both episodes, both parts, in a big old, good old-fashioned summary. So I just want to first cover off something from the previous episode, and that is on the topic of volume. You may have listened to the last episode and thought I was recommending an extremely high amount of volume for a beginner. Well, as I tried to make quite clear in the last episode, this training plan starts from a point where there has already been a lot of consistent training and accumulated volume for a long period of time. And I would recommend you to be sure to listen to episode 9 on why high volume matters. That'll go over the importance of high volume. But training consistently and accumulating volume over a long period of time is going to look, however, very different for a lot of people. I would expect that anyone taking on the challenge of a marathon should have been doing at least 20, if not 30 kilometers per week for a good few months before they begin their base building phase. Look, a marathon is not a distance that should be taken lightly. It is, of course, more popular now than ever before to run a marathon, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And it certainly doesn't mean that everyone completing a marathon is doing it in a sustainable and risk-free way, a way that I would recommend or advocate for. I think anyone who completes a marathon distance is worthy of congratulating. It is a distance that demands a lot of the body, but there is a smart way to do it and a not so smart way to do it. If you're concerned about the volume required to take on a marathon in a sensible way, then have a think to yourself about whether a marathon is the right thing for you to be chasing right now. Running a marathon is not just about the race itself. It's a commitment to months of dedicated training, and for some people, potentially years of building before then. If you're an experienced marathoner, you will know the amount of dedication it takes to do your best job at the distance. Dedicating the time it takes to accumulate the necessary volume and following a training plan that demands this much from you is not an easy feat. And today we're going to talk about as many of the possible challenges that can get in the way as possible and how we can approach them. Perfection is bullshit. Perfection is bullshit. As I said in the last episode, if you are a human with a life, you will not be able to perfectly execute a pre-written training plan. You just won't. There are simply too many things that will get in the way of our training, and so many times we need to adapt the training plan on the fly. We're not looking for perfection here. We're looking for a well-executed training block. So what does that look like? What does good execution look like? So that's our first point that we're going to cover off today. What does good execution look like? Well, I have 3 things here that I'd want you to think about in relation to good execution and what that looks like. what does good execution look like? Well, the first is aiming to show up to 95% of what we have planned. Aiming to show up to 95% of what you have planned. Why so high? That seems unreasonable. Well, we're setting this target high for a particular reason. We want to avoid having to adapt the plan as much as possible. Although today, of course, I will give you as many different options and ways to think about adapting the plan where necessary. We do want to avoid it. I've coached people to the marathon distance, whether it's the first time or whether they're going for a sub 3 or some other target. And the ones who simply show up the most did the best. It really is that simple. The ones where the plan required consistent adaptation and changes performed the worst. Every time we go through a way to adapt these plans, you'll notice a theme. There will be less to do, less volume, less frequency, or less intensity. This will have a negative impact on your training goals. What we're avoiding is a worse impact on your training goals. Overdoing it and not adapting appropriately can be a much less productive way to train. And what we're avoiding is a much worse situation of overtraining or burnout or any of the possible bigger problems. But for the best results on race day, we want to aim to show up as much as we possibly can. So aim to show up to 95% of what is planned. The second point on what does good execution look like? 100% execution. 100% execution. Last week, I mentioned the rule of 100% execution. What I mean by that is trying to aim to execute each workout, whether it's an easy recovery run, a long run, a quality workout, whatever it is, whatever goal or purpose is in mind for that workout, try to execute that 100%. So it doesn't matter if you've adapted the plan and you're now doing an easy run instead of a speed session, for example. Execute that easy run 100%. Don't suddenly turn it into a tempo because you felt like it. Commit to it and execute 100%. 100% execution. And the third and final point on what does good execution look like? Early adaptation. Early adaptation. The last thing to make sure you're doing is responding to the signs, the missed workout, the change of plan as soon as you possibly can. Don't let something sit for too long. You can leave it for too long and then it's too late or a big adjustment has to happen. We want each plan adaptation to be minimal. The smaller the change in plan, the smaller the effect. Catch it early. Early adaptation. So that's what good execution looks like. Aiming to show up to 95% of what we have planned, 100% execution, and early adaptation. Now we're going to run into the main bulk of this episode, how to adapt your training plan. How to adapt your training plan. Life happens, whether it's due to illness, injury, schedule conflicts, or unexpected fatigue. Adapting your marathon training plan is a necessary part of the process. A successful marathon training cycle isn't about executing every run perfectly, but rather managing challenges effectively. So, I have, 10 different scenarios here, 10 points to go through, and I'm going to do my best job at giving a little bit of advice for each one, 2 or 3 points for each one that you can think about, and hopefully that will equip you with something to think about every time one of these pops up, and hopefully something practical so you can look at your plan and adapt it accordingly. So the first point here I have is listen to your body. Listen to your body. Your body is really the best indicator of when you need to adjust your training. You have to pay attention to the signs of overtraining, injury, or burnout. You are the best person to ask when it comes to thinking about how you feel and whether you're ready for each workout on the schedule. So it's super important that you're listening to your body and you make the right call based on how you feel. So I have 3 little points here: fatigue, pain, and mental burnout. So on fatigue, if you feel persistently tired or sluggish, or like every workout is just a bit of a big push and you feel like you're needing to find motivation elsewhere to get out the door, you can consider reducing the intensity or taking a rest day. I tend to think that if you're 5 or 6 workouts into really feeling like this, you are showing pretty serious signs of fatigue, and it might be down to some overtraining. So the one thing I would say that you want to reduce in this case is the intensity in which you're working. A lot of your easy runs, a lot of the time for most people, are going to be too fast. The simple fact is most people don't train easy enough. The easy training tends to slip into faster training. You might have time constraints, you might feel like you're in a rush, and that's only natural. But when you're feeling tired, when you're feeling fatigued like this, there's always opportunity to reduce the intensity. So first, think about how easy your easy runs are. Are they easy enough? Could you slow them down? Could you make your long runs more of a walk run? Lower the intensity. The second option for you is to take a rest day. Rest days can be powerful tools if put in at the right time. If you are feeling really fatigued and you're being religious about every workout, try just taking a rest day. Take a day off where you need to and let your body recoup and get to where it needs to be. So that's fatigue. The second is pain. Persistent pain, especially sharp or sort of localized pain, may indicate an injury. So you really need to make sure you're listening to your body and taking note of any pains that are coming up. Some pains could be dull and only happening when you're running, and they might pass. But some pains, if they're persistent, if they're sharp and localized, and if they still hurt outside of your running, that may indicate an injury, and it's worth taking that seriously. So the first option for you in this case is to take a rest day, skip a run. And the second and most important option is to seek advice from a physio. I know that not everyone is going to have access to a physiotherapist, but if you can figure out a way to seek professional advice and go and see a physiotherapist, their job will be to get you up to baseline, to make sure that you're able to carry on where you left off. So listen to your body, and if you feel a pain, if it's a persistent pain, especially sharp and localized, it may indicate an injury. So skip a run and see if you can seek professional advice from a physio. The third point on listening to your body, maybe a more difficult one, is mental burnout. Mental burnout. If you're feeling unmotivated or you're dreading every run, this can be an indication of something deeper, and you can put it down to a bit of mental burnout. There's a lot of things going on in your life. You might have stressful work, you might have a stressful home environment. Adding on marathon training to that poses serious risk. And if you're feeling unmotivated, if you're feeling like you're dreading every single run, try and lighten your training load and give yourself a mental reset. Think about the intensity in which you're working, think about the amount of volume you're doing, and be strategic about changing that so that you can get your energy back, get your mental attitude to a better place. You can give yourself a mental reset just by taking a few days off, or just by taking a few days easier and adapting accordingly so that you get yourself to a point where you're mentally excited and energized about the work ahead. So listen to your body is point 1. Fatigue, pain, mental burnout, all things that can get in the way. So it might sometimes be worth just taking a step back, taking a rest day, lowering the volume, or thinking about how intensely you're working to get yourself to that point where you're no longer fatigued, you're no longer feeling that pain, and you're mentally energized and out of that burnout state. Okay, the second point on how to adapt your training plan. Adjusting for missed workouts. Adjusting for missed workouts. It is possible and common that you will miss a run or even a whole week of runs, but it doesn't mean your marathon goals are completely doomed. And so here's how to handle a missed session. If you miss 1 to 2 runs, if you just skipped a run and you weren't able to show up, bearing in mind we're looking to show up to 95% of what we have planned, so this shouldn't happen more than 1 in 20 runs, if you're really keeping to that. But if you miss one of your workouts, don't worry too much. You can get away with skipping that run and just moving on to the next workout as planned. You will have a lot of rest between one run and another if you miss one, and so you should be in a good state to just crack on and show up to the next session. Don't try and make up for lost mileage. Don't try and make up for lost mileage. It's really important that you don't try and add more in your next run so you make up for your missed run. If you skip it, if you've missed a run, just ignore the fact that you've missed it and crack on as normal. You may show up to your next workout. It might be an easy run. It might be a tempo run with a better state of mind. It might have been something that you needed. But for whatever reason you've missed your run, if it's just one occasional run, don't worry too much. You can get away with just showing up to your next run. If you've missed a long run, long runs are a really essential part of your week. And if you miss your long run, it's important that you don't just suddenly jump straight back up to where you were in the next week. If possible, you want to shorten your next week's runs and insert a modified long run, which doesn't exceed the planned distance. It might be that you slightly decrease your volume by shortening your runs and then do a third or 30% of that week's volume as your long run. But make sure, because you've missed quite a considerable amount of your previous week's volume by missing that long run, make sure you don't try and make up for it. You're going to have to shorten that long run a little bit and just adjust according to the volume. I always measure my long runs based on 30% of my total weekly volume. If your long run is too much more than that, then you may be having too much of a long run in your week. So if you are only doing, let's say, 40 kilometers in a week and you're making your long run 20 kilometers, you've put half of your total weekly volume in a long run. That's too much. So make sure if you miss a long run, you crack on with the rest of your training, maybe shortening each run slightly and then calculating the length of that next long run based on 30% of that week's volume. Maybe you've missed a week or more. So you've gone through missing 1 or 2 runs or missing a long run. Maybe you've missed a whole week. This is obviously not ideal if you're training for a marathon to miss an entire week, but it does happen. Some people pick up injuries and you're going to have to take some serious time off. What you want to do in this case is you want to ease back by repeating an earlier week of your training. This might reduce the intensity, it might reduce the mileage for the first week, but you want to be able to ramp back up to the volume you were at. So you might want to pick a previous week, maybe from a week before or 2 weeks before, do that week, and then jump back to the volume you were on. This is going to ease you back into the volume you were on without completely overdoing it suddenly. The worst thing you want to do is just jump back in to the planned week after a week off. This is going to be too much demand on the body, and you want to ramp back up to the point you were at. So try picking a week earlier, repeating a previous week of your training plan before jumping back to the volume you were on. So that's adjusting for missed workouts. 1 or 2 missed runs, just skip it and move on. A missed long run, lower the volume of your next week and then calculate the next week's long run based on 30% of that. And then if you miss a whole week or more, ease back by repeating an earlier week of your training to ramp back up to the volume within a 2 or 3 week period. Point 3 is shorten or lengthen your training plan. Sometimes life might demand a significant adjustment in your plan's overall timeline. Obviously, we were talking last week about a 20 or so week training plan. It might be that you need more time or you need less time because the race is coming up and you've left it too late. So, shortening the plan. If you're starting late or if you have suddenly signed up to a race that is in a short period of time, focus on building mileage and skip some of the advanced workouts like speed work, intervals, tempo, threshold, all that stuff. you really should be prioritizing endurance in this plan. Don't have a shortened plan and just throw in loads of intensity thinking that you're going to get further with that. Endurance should be the priority if you're shortening the plan. So make sure you're focusing more on volume and mileage rather than how intense your workouts are. Extending the plan. So if you have extra time, maybe you are giving yourself more time and you are planning ahead and you want to get started on something that is in 6 months' time. If you do have extra time, maybe repeat a lower intensity week and sort of consolidate your fitness before moving into the next phase. In those early base building phases, you can have them as long as you want, really. And the more time you give that phase, the better. So if you are extending your plan, you really want to just be extending that first phase of your plan, that base building phase, by having a lot of lower intensity, easy training, a lot of foundational building stuff, and improving your fitness before moving into those next more intense phases. So that's shorten or lengthen your training plan. Shortening the plan, focusing on volume, making sure your focus is on endurance and not intensity. And if you're extending the plan, also have more lower intensity stuff in there early on to build that base. And then we can really focus on some of the intense stuff later on and executing that better. If you are extending your plan and you're adding more base in there, it might feel like, I wanted to extend my plan so I could do more intensity. I think when you get to that 5 or 6 week phase of high intensity race specific stuff, you will be thanking me for telling you to build endurance and build a base before you get there. That's a very intense phase and you shouldn't be doing that all year round. You're peaking. And the best way to peak is by having a big base, a big foundation to build on. Think of it like a tall skyscraper. The more sound the foundation, the taller the building can be. So the more base building, the more foundation you build, the harder you can go in those more intense phases later in your training. Number 4, adapting to injuries. Adapting to injuries. This is obviously a big one and something that sometimes we can't always control. But running through injuries and ignoring them often leads to worse outcomes. So you want to make sure you're approaching these injuries wisely and you're not just ignoring them. If you think back to point 1, listen to your body. When you feel a pain, catch it early. If it's sharp and localized and it's hurting outside of your running, you want to catch this injury as early as possible. So these are sort of 3 steps that I would advise you think about when adapting your training without compromising your health. The first is reduce impact. Reduce impact. Running is a pretty high impact movement and it can be something that just demands a lot of the body and this can cause injuries. So we want to think about how we can reduce that impact but maintain fitness. So you can replace your runs with some cross training. Cross training is a great way to get into something that's a little bit different, maintain fitness, but have lower impact on the body. So something like swimming or cycling or the elliptical are great ways to maintain that fitness, but reduce the impact on the body. So reduce impact. The second step would be to modify your workouts. Modify your workouts. If you are feeling an injury coming on, if you have an injury and you're trying to adapt your training plan, avoiding speed work or long runs that are too long are a really important way to think about adapting your training. These speed sessions, these quality workouts, and the long runs are really only there if you're in good nick. If you're not feeling good, if you feel like you have an injury, your focus should be on all of the easy training, the low impact training, and making sure you've got good endurance, good fitness there. And then everything else is only available to you when you're in good nick. So avoid speed work or long runs until you're pain-free, and then you can start throwing them in again. So you might want to replace a speed work with a recovery run or an easy run. Your injury might not be too severe, so it might be that you can continue training and you're just keeping tabs on it. That interval session that you've got on the cards can be replaced by an easy run. And rebuild gradually. Rebuild gradually. Once you are recovered, start with easy runs and rebuild your intensity nice and slowly. There might be some workouts in there that have been added just for sort of added intensity and stressors. You can consider dropping those potentially non-essential workouts and making sure that you're building that endurance and you've got a nice amount of easy training in there. Easy training is the foundation of all of your volume, and you need to rebuild that volume gradually. So give it a few weeks to come back to the volume you want to be at and focus mostly on easy training. Look, injuries are a difficult one. Of course, we'll do plenty more on injuries in this podcast. Many episodes dedicated to dealing with those injuries. It's not easy. It's a tough thing to modify for, and it's dependent, of course, on the injury itself. So you have to focus on listening to your body in point one and make sure that you're catching these things early. If it is too late and you're at a point where you're taking weeks and weeks off, this can be very impactful for your marathon training. If it's stopping you from training for 3, 4, 5 weeks, then you should have a look at your entire plan and see how much volume you've been able to accumulate. It's going to be really difficult in the later stages or even halfway through your training plan to suddenly get back to the volume you need to be at. So it's important that you have real conversations with yourself when you're thinking about the long-term benefits of running and what it means for you. If you get injured midway through your training plan and it's taken a massive hit on how well you're able to execute, a wise person would approach that and question whether the marathon is doable anymore. It's a tough conversation to have with yourself, but it's not worth sacrificing your health generally for a short-term injury. Something like a IT band syndrome or a pulled muscle, that is something you can overcome, and in the long term you can run many marathons if you approach it appropriately and wisely. But if you don't, if you ignore it, if you just try and push on, you can cause so much more pain and discomfort, and you can cause a long-standing injury that is really difficult to get back from. So consider the worst case scenario when you're thinking about your injuries. The worst case scenario could be that you push on for this one marathon and you're never able to run properly again. And you'll constantly have this niggle that is just never fixable. So there's a long path to getting back to full strength if you ignore these injuries. So don't ignore them, take them very seriously. If they are manageable, reduce the impact by cross-training, modify the workouts, avoid the speed work and long runs until you're pain-free, and rebuild gradually. Once you're recovered, start with these easy runs and rebuild the intensity slowly. Point 5, adjusting for overtraining. Adjusting for overtraining. Overtraining syndrome can completely derail your marathon goals if you ignore it. You have to look for warning signs like extreme fatigue, poor performance, frequent illnesses, irritability. These are all signs of overtraining. And if you do suspect overtraining, here are 3 things I want you to think about. The first is step back. Step back. If you're overtraining, the first thing you want to do is step back, reduce your mileage and your intensity for at least a week. 1 week of dropped mileage is not going to be as impactful as you might think. Dropping your mileage by 30% for a week is a great way to stay consistent, keep showing up, but making sure you're not overtraining and you're keeping yourself ready for the following week. So step back. Prioritize recovery. Prioritize recovery. Add in extra rest days. You have at your disposal 7 days to play with. You might be working with 6 days and one day of rest. You might be on a 7-day week training plan with no rest days. At that point, you want to start looking at how much you're resting, how many rest days you have in there. And it's important to prioritize this, prioritize your recovery. So throw in a rest day. 1 day off is not going to have massive impact. And if you're currently overtraining, having a rest day can be a huge, how would I put it? It can be the magic pill. It can be something that sorts you out. It might just be a little bit of overtraining, and one day off sorts you out and gets you back on track. Sleep more. When you're prioritizing recovery, the golden bullet of recovery is sleep. Try as much as you can to prioritize your sleep. There are plenty of people out there who train for marathons and don't really consider their sleep as much as they need to. You're going to be demanding a lot of your body throughout this training plan and a lot of yourself. So making sure you're sleeping well is so important. And finally, focus on nutrition. As part of recovery, nutrition is super important as well. Making sure you're eating good, whole foods, high protein diet is essential for your recovery. And finally, seek professional guidance. Seek professional guidance. As much as I'm advocating for you managing your own training as you do, try and look for some sort of sports psychologist or running coach that can help you adjust your plan and prevent further burnout. I'm talking in this case of when things are getting really serious. There are some people who will train themselves to the ground and cause what we like to call burnout. This is something that goes a bit deeper than just, okay, you're training a bit hard. Sometimes you need to speak with someone like a therapist or even just a running coach who can take a look at how you're thinking about all of this and how you're approaching it. And it might be that you're taking it all too seriously. It might be that you are doing it for the wrong reasons. And that can sometimes cause you to overtrain and work too hard, essentially. So looking for an external point of view, someone that you trust, or a professional, a running coach or a sports psychologist or a therapist even, can be something really powerful where you can kind of look at how you're approaching all of this and think about whether it's a healthy approach. So when adjusting for overtraining, step back, reduce your mileage and intensity for at least a week, prioritize recovery, get rest days, sleep more, focus on nutrition, and maybe even seek professional guidance if it runs deep. Okay, point number 6, adapting for your time constraints. Adapting for time constraints. We all have many different responsibilities. We all have busy lives, some more busy than others. Like I like to say, London is filled with people who think they're the busiest person in London. But it's true, we are all time constrained. We all have a lot of responsibilities that can interfere with our training. So here is how I would advise adapting based on your time constraints. I have 3 little points here for you. Sub-points. Shorten workouts. Shorten workouts. If you really are time constrained, there are ways to reduce the amount of time you're training by simply reducing the duration of a midweek run, but aiming to maintain the intensity or quality. Remember, 100% execution is always key, but it might be that you take 1 kilometer off, take 2 kilometers off, and just reduce that overall mileage to give yourself a bit of extra time. This could mean a 3 miles at tempo instead of 5 miles at tempo. Think about how you can shave off small amounts of time if you're really time pressured, but you're still ultimately getting the training in, you're showing up, something is better than nothing. So shorten your workouts. Prioritize long runs. Prioritize long runs. Long runs are such a critical part of marathon success. One of the reasons why I advise getting into a routine of having 1 long run a week is because it's just so fundamental to be building your endurance in that way through long runs. So if you're prioritizing anything, try and prioritize those long runs. This does not mean that you should be throwing in a long run that's 70% of your weekly volume, because I've said prioritize long runs, but it does mean that your long runs should be considered a real fundamental part of your training. And so trying to find those 2 hours, those 3 hours where you can just dedicate it to your long run is going to be really important. If you can communicate to the people around you how important that is for your training and they understand it, it's going to be a really helpful way to bring other people along for the ride and have people buy into what you're trying to do. I do mine on a Sunday. It's the emptiest day of the week, and so I have more hours than any other day, so I tend to put my long runs in a Sunday, but sometimes those Sundays can get busy. In those times, I will make sure to organize my Sunday in a way where I've dedicated a certain amount of time to doing that long run and prioritizing that long run in the week because it's such an essential part of my training. So really try and think about prioritizing long runs. If it's tight, if it's difficult, prioritize them. They're the most critical part of your marathon success. And then thirdly, combine workouts. If you miss a tempo run, for example, you can actually integrate that tempo into sort of segments into your long run instead. There are ways to play with your training plan, so you can throw in some sort of modality into a different one. Long runs are a great time to do this. Long runs, for the most part, should be executed very easy with low intensity. So it might be that you throw in some strides in the middle that you had earlier on in the week that you didn't end up executing on. Or it might be that there's some tempo distance earlier in the week that you can throw in a little bit of in your long run. Play around, combine workouts. That might be a great way to adapt your training plan if you have time constraints. So adapting for time constraints, shorten your workouts, reduce the duration of your midweek runs, but aim to maintain the intensity or quality. Prioritize long runs. They're the most critical part of your marathon success. And combine workouts. If you miss something, maybe think about how you can throw it into a different run in a gentle and sensible way. Number 7, weather-related adaptations. If you live somewhere where the weather is as unpredictable as I do in the UK, then you know full well how much this can disrupt your outdoor runs. So here's how to adjust. Okay, 2 points here. Extreme heat or cold. A lot of people listening to this will be dealing with a lot of cold weather at the moment. And it might be that you want to figure out how to get your training in because it's icy underfoot or it's just too cold to run outside. You can shift to an indoor treadmill run. This is something that's going to demand less of your body, so it's worth being cognizant of that. I tend to think that good advice is adding a little bit of a 1% incline. So if you can just incline your treadmill a little bit, it's a good tip to make it a little bit harder and to make it a little bit more similar to running outside. So put a little bit of an incline on that treadmill and replace your runs with treadmill runs. Don't do this too often. If you can help it, outdoor running is the better option. I did once train someone who was constantly replacing their outdoor runs for treadmill work, and then they'd tell me after, and I didn't really know how to tell them. It just wasn't as productive. The fact is, treadmill running is not the same as running outside, but it can be a nice little replacement if there are weather-related adaptations necessary. So you can shift to an indoor run. You can shorten the run. If it's too hot or too cold outside, you can shorten that run a little bit and focus on effort rather than pace. And then rain or snow. It's important that throughout this marathon training plan, you are able as you can to take on these weather conditions. There's something to be said for running in the rain. I think a lot of people would attest. It is, once you're out there, sometimes more enjoyable than other weather conditions. So if it's a bit rainy, don't worry too much. Your skin's waterproof, but try maybe to invest in some weather appropriate gear, waterproof layers, or even traction devices on your feet if you need them, if you're in really crazy conditions. For unsafe conditions, I would recommend again substituting with cross training indoors. There are great things you can do to cross train, whether it's the treadmill, whether it's on the bike or swimming. That is good training. And if the weather is so extreme, if you really can't train outside, then a safer substitute of training indoors can be an option for you. So there are adaptations that you can implement rarely, hopefully, in your training plan when it comes to weather-related adaptations. If it's extreme heat or cold, you can shift to an indoor treadmill, put that treadmill on an incline. Finally, I just want to say focusing on effort rather than pace is going to be really important when it comes to weather-related adaptations. If it's really windy, for example, it might be that you're just simply not able to get to the paces you were getting at. So you want to be focusing on effort rather than pace. Weather can change your pace a huge amount and make it a lot harder to run at certain paces. So focusing on your effort rather than your pace is a good little rule of thumb there. Number 8, adapting to fatigue or low energy days. Adapting to fatigue or low energy days. Some days, your energy might just feel a bit lower than expected. Now that's okay. We all have it. So, instead of skipping the workout entirely, here are some options for you. Number 1, reduce intensity. Reduce intensity. If you are feeling really fatigued and just low energy and you just can't be arsed, just try and be easy on yourself, slow down the pace or shorten the run. It's important to make sure you're listening to yourself. If you are feeling really fatigued and you just don't have the energy one day, you can sometimes just slow it down or shave a few kilometers off that particular run. Reducing that intensity is an option for you. Switch to easy miles. Switch to easy miles. A lot of these speed sessions can just be replaced with an easy run. Of course, we want to try and show up to everything we have on the training plan, but if you're really feeling fatigued, you're really low on energy, you might want to switch in an easy run. It might be more suitable for you to do an easy run and leave the quality session for a different day. And rest if needed. Rest if needed. If your fatigue does persist, like we said earlier, then a rest day may be more beneficial for you than pushing through. I've found sometimes that just giving myself one day off, just a rest day, ignoring my Strava and giving myself what I need, can be the magic pill for getting back to where I want to be and feeling high energy the next day. So adapting to fatigue or low energy days, reduce the intensity, slow down the pace or shorten the run, switch to easy miles. Easy miles are always an option if you want to replace a speed session with an easy run or walk, and rest if needed. If fatigue persists, then it might be a rest day that you need. Number 9 is a bit of a rarer occasion, but it does happen. Adjusting for race rescheduling. Adjusting for race rescheduling. Sometimes races get postponed or they get rescheduled and we have to adapt on the fly. So for short delays, maybe there's a 1 to 4 week delay to your race, I would say just repeat the taper phase to maintain your fitness without overtraining. It's rare that a race date would be changed at all, let alone just a sort of 4-week change. But if it does happen, then you can just extend your taper phase and maintain your fitness in a sensible way. Just keeping a lot of easy training in there, maybe throwing in one bit of speed work in there each week. You're not going to lose your fitness all that much, if at all, if you just keep up your training consistently. So repeat the taper phase to maintain fitness without overtraining. For longer delays, like a 2 or more month delay, I would transition to a maintenance phase, transition to your base building phase, running sort of 70 to 80% of peak mileage until you can begin a new training cycle. So drop that mileage from your peak phase to about 70 to 80% of that and keeping it nice and easy, base building, maintenance phase. You want to keep your fitness at the same level before you dive straight into a high intensity peak phase. So adjusting for short delays, just repeat that taper. Adjusting for longer delays, transition to a maintenance phase. And then the last point 10 to round it off that I just want to go over is working with a coach or training partner. Working with a coach or training partner. I am, of course, trying to equip you with as much knowledge as I can in a short period of time here to have you equipped and ready to have the knowledge that you need to adapt your training plan and follow the training plan. But if you are struggling to adapt your plan or write your own plan, consulting a coach or an experienced running partner can provide valuable perspective. So plug into that community you have. There might be people out there that can give you advice. If you want to pay for a coach, it's a great tool to lean on. They're going to give you fountains of knowledge so that they can help sort of go back and forth with you and think about the best adaptation necessary. But they're going to help you modify workouts to fit your current situation, reassess long-term goals and adjust expectations, and they'll keep you accountable while being realistic about changes. Having that person to lean on is very valuable. And if you're really serious about your goals, it might be something that you want to invest in. So there's a quick run through of some of the different scenarios that I could think of: listening to your body, adjusting for missed workouts, shorten or lengthen your training plan, adapting to injuries, adjusting for overtraining, adapting for time constraints, weather-related adaptations, adapting to fatigue or lower energy days, adjusting for race rescheduling, and the importance of working with a coach or training partner if you can. With all of these adaptations, you'll notice that there's a theme, like I mentioned earlier, and that is to lower the volume or lower the intensity. And that's because really we're just trying to look after ourselves, look after our body. For all of these scenarios, you will want to lower the intensity, lower the volume, but keep a consistent training practice. Just stopping altogether for weeks on end and then running straight back into it is not the way to do it. You want to prioritize keeping some sort of training going and remembering the rule that something is better than nothing. If you can consistently show up and keep training, show up to 95% of what you have on the cards, you're going to do very well in this marathon. So make sure you are just training consistently, you are showing up and you're doing what you can, and the adaptations are caught early so that they're small and they don't impact your overall training all that much. Okay, now we're going to talk about mindset tips for adapting your plan. Mindset tips for adapting your plan. I have 4 here, but of course there's going to be plenty more little mindset tips that you can play on and have in the back pocket, but I have 4. The first is stay positive. Stay positive. Missing workouts or making adjustments is not a failure. It's not a failure. What it is, though, is smart training. If you can look at your training in a positive light and make sure those adaptations don't seem like, oh, it's a failure, I'm stepping away from my training plan, but rather it's just smart adaptations, it's smart training, it's being the best you possibly can as you approach this training. Staying positive and keeping a positive attitude is really an important part of this, because all of the training you do, all of these adaptations you make are going to contribute to your marathon. They're going to contribute to your marathon. So it's not a setback, it's not necessarily always a failure, but it's smart training. So stay positive. Secondly, focus on the big picture. Focus on the big picture. One single missed run won't define your marathon. If you miss a workout or if you have to adapt something slightly, it's not going to have as massive an impact as you might think. Focus on the big picture. This is all about accumulating volume and accumulating all of that hard work. Think about your progress over weeks and months rather than that just that one time that you had to make an adjustment. So focus on the big picture. Be flexible. Be flexible. These plans that we've built are just guidelines. They're not rigid rules. You have to adapt what works for your life and your body. You are a human. You're not a robot. You have to be able to be flexible because you're dealing with something that's really hard to do. You're putting your body through a lot and your body will respond in unexpected ways. Your life will throw in unexpected challenges. You have to be flexible. You have to adapt to what you have in front of you. So be flexible. And finally, trust the process. Trust the process. Even with all these changes, with all these adaptations and side steps, consistency over time is really the thing that will yield the best results. You have to trust this process. You might think that there's a lot of easy training in here and it's not enough marathon pace and you don't know if you're going to be able to do it. Trust the process. Trust that your body is adapting to all of this easy training, that you're building endurance, and that is a really important pillar when it comes to executing on a marathon. So trust the process. Adapting your marathon training plan is just part of the journey. So by remaining flexible and prioritizing your health, you will ensure that you'll arrive at the start line ready to give your best effort on race day. So there's a few mindset tips for adapting your plan. Stay positive, focus on the big picture, be flexible, and trust the process. Dealing with setbacks. Dealing with setbacks. Training rarely goes perfectly. I don't think I've ever executed a perfect training block. So here's how to sort of navigate those challenges. Of course, we've gone through a load of different specific ways that you can adapt your training and make calls on how to move forward. But here are some general rules that I think if you remember this, then it might be the most important part of this episode. So I have 4 rules here that I'm going to go through. Missed workouts. Don't try to make up for lost mileage. Simply return to your plan. Don't try to make up for lost mileage. Simply return to your plan. The highest amount of volume that you should be going back to on your next run is what was already in the plan. If you are skipping a run, if you've missed it, you've given yourself some extra rest, but you've skipped that run, don't try and make up for that missed mileage in the next run. Just return to your plan. Second rule, injuries. Cross-train to maintain fitness while avoiding high-impact activities. If you're faced with an injury, one of the best things you can do is cross-train to maintain that fitness, to keep that cardiovascular health up and running, and avoid high-impact activities. You can do a lot whilst you're injured if you're willing. If you're willing to cross-train, willing to be creative with what type of work you're doing, you can cross-train, maintain that fitness, and avoid the high-impact activity that is running. Rule 3, plateaus. Evaluate your recovery, nutrition, and sleep. Overtraining can stall progress. Evaluate your recovery, nutrition, and sleep. Overtraining can stall progress. If you're hitting a plateau, if you don't feel like you're really getting anywhere with your running, you're not getting anywhere with your training, really think about the other side of the coin, the recovery, the nutrition, the sleep. If you're overtraining, if you're putting too much work in, that can actually be a detriment to your progress. So think about the other side of the coin. Evaluate your recovery, your nutrition, and your sleep. And then the final rule for dealing with setbacks, mental fatigue. Shorten or skip a run to recharge, or switch to a fun route or pace. There are many things that we can do to try and keep ourselves interested. Mental fatigue is a very real one. And if you're dealing with mental fatigue, try and go easy on yourself. Shorten the run or skip a run to recharge, and just try and make it a little bit more fun or interesting. Change the route, change the pacing, maybe throw in a fartlek. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're bored of the training. Try and keep it interesting. So there are my 4 general rules on all of this. Missed workout, try not to make up for lost mileage. Simply return to your plan. Injuries, cross-train to maintain fitness while avoiding high-impact activities. Plateaus, evaluate your recovery, nutrition, and sleep. Overtraining can stall progress. And mental fatigue, shorten or skip a run to recharge, or switch up to a more fun route. Next up, I have 5 little mindset tips for you. Mindset tips, how to show up consistently. Number 1, focus on progress. Focus on progress. It's really important throughout the process, to focus on progress and celebrate those small victories. Every single completed run is a step closer to your goals. You're adding a brick to the wall. Every time you show up is a win. Focus on the progress. Don't get too caught up in the whole picture. I know I said earlier, focus on the big picture. When you're stressing about missing a run, focus on the big picture. When you're overwhelmed by that big picture, focus on the progress. Celebrate those small victories. Number 2, be guilt-free. Life happens. Adapt your plan without guilt. If you feel guilty about everything you're doing, if you're attaching a negative narrative to what you're doing, and you feel guilty that you haven't shown up to what was written in the plan and you're having to adapt it, don't think like that. Life happens. These things are normal. We're supposed to be working out smartly. If we're staying positive as a mindset tip, and we're not thinking about our adjustments as a failure and thinking of them as smart training, then in the same way, be guilt-free. Life happens. Number 3, don't evaluate too much. Take action. Don't evaluate too much. Just take action. You should try and have this as a non-negotiable. In terms of showing up consistently, we're thinking about mindset tips to show up consistently. You should really be thinking about each workout as a non-negotiable. It's just something that gets done. Avoid choice. Don't give yourself the option. If you make it negotiable, if you give yourself the option, then you will more often than not choose the option to not show up. So make it a non-negotiable. Plan ahead. Don't evaluate too much. If you've got to run after work, don't start thinking too much about how you feel and whether you want to. Don't follow your mood. Just go out and do the thing. Take action. There are so many scenarios where you'll go out and realize that you actually do have the energy for it. So this is a fine balance to strike, of course. If you are listening to your body, you're taking note of how you feel, but at the same time, you are not making it a negotiable topic, whether you run or not. You have to strike that balance. Showing up regardless of how you feel is not wise, but showing up and not following your mood is also wise. Two seemingly contradicting things can be true at the same time. Fourth mindset tip for showing up consistently. Visualize success. Visualize success. Sometimes I quite like to picture myself at the finish line of a race, crossing that finish line, looking strong, smiling, happy and proud of myself. Visualizing that success, I'm not saying you're manifesting, but it can be a great way to encourage you to show up on a daily basis. If you think about the goal, think about why you're doing it, visualize yourself successfully completing that goal. That could be a nice little mindset tip to help you show up consistently. And then finally, my final little mindset tip to show up consistently. Find accountability. Find accountability. Plenty of people that are into running, plenty of people you could get into running. Try and run with friends or join a running group if you want to. Share the journey, because that keeps the motivation high. If you surround yourselves with the right people and you make sure you're being accountable to what you've promised to do, that can be really helpful to showing up consistently. If you've planned a run with a mate in the morning, you're going to be more likely to show up. So, it's 5 little mindset tips for you to show up consistently. Focus on progress. Be guilt-free. Don't evaluate too much. Take action. Visualize success and find accountability. And now finally, I have 3 attitudes to maintain for you. 3 attitudes to maintain. These are pillars, life pillars, you could say. I think they're always something I try and strive for. I don't always get right. But I think it is fundamental in anything that you're doing to keep these 3 attitudes. And they are patience, resilience, and curiosity. So patience. Building endurance takes time. All of this takes a lot of time. You won't see any physiological adaptations for weeks and weeks. So avoid rushing your mileage or intensity increases. I think I've probably said this enough over the course of the last episode and this one, but being patient with this process is such a fundamental attitude to maintain. If you're not patient, if you don't trust the process, if you rush into high volume and high intensity, you're going to cause more problems than you're happy with. So be patient. Resilience. Every runner faces setbacks. Every runner. Everyone who's trying to do hard things faces setbacks. What matters is how you respond. And I hope that this episode has equipped you with some knowledge, at least, of how you can respond to these setbacks, to these requirements for adaptation. But maintaining a resilient attitude is a fundamental rule when approaching following this training plan. And how you respond is a better indicator of your character than whether it happens at all. And finally, curiosity. Treat training as an experiment. Learn what works for you in terms of pace, fueling, recovery, and have fun with it. Stay curious. I'm personally fascinated by all this stuff. I love to learn as much as I possibly can about it. And every time I face a setback or something comes up, I see it as a data point. Oh, I've got a little niggle in my right knee. What's that? Data. I'm curious about what it means. Or I'm starting to feel a little bit fatigued. Data. What does that mean? Why? Stay curious. Stay patient, resilient, and curious. So there are 3 attitudes to maintain in your pursuit of getting to the marathon distance. Patience, resilience, curiosity. Okay, my friend, that's been a lot. We've gone through a huge amount in the last 2 episodes. I hope it's been helpful for you. I hope you've learned something. I hope I've repeated the things that I think are the most important enough. So now let's try and summarize everything we've heard in part 1 and 2. So when it comes to building your marathon training plan, how long should you train for a marathon? Well, what matters most here is context. If you've been training for a long period of time and you're at decent volume, then you can go into a 20 or 16-week training program. If you're an experienced runner and you're training a lot all the time, then a concerted 10 to 12-week training plan can be helpful for you, but you're sort of entering in at the later stages of that phased approach. So give yourself at least 20 weeks. Key workouts to execute. We went through easy runs, long runs, tempo runs, threshold runs, intervals, hill repeats, recovery runs, fartlek, progression running, and strides. Periodization, the building blocks of marathon training. The first phase is the base phase, where we're building an aerobic base and developing consistency. Then we're going into the build phase, increasing mileage and introducing some intensity. Then we're peaking in the peak phase, where we reach peak fitness and stimulate race conditions. And then we finally finish off in the taper phase, reducing the mileage to recover and prepare for race day and get to the start line feeling fresh. We went over the importance of variety being such a crucial part of a well-rounded and effective training plan. And then we spoke about additional elements to include in your plan: strength training, nutrition, rest days, cross-training. And today we've gone over what good execution looks like. 95% of what we have planned we should be showing up for. 100% execution and early adaptation. How to adapt your training plan, listen to your body, adjust for missed workouts, shorten or lengthen your training plan, adapting to injuries, adjusting for overtraining, adapting for time constraints, weather-related adaptations, adapting to fatigue or low energy days, adjusting for race rescheduling, and working with a coach or training partner. And then we went through some mindset tips for adapting your training plan. Stay positive, focus on the big picture, be flexible, and trust the process. Dealing with setbacks, missed workouts, injuries, plateaus, mental fatigue. Don't try and make up for lost mileage. Simply return to your plan. Cross-train to maintain fitness while avoiding high-impact activities. Evaluate your recovery, nutrition, and sleep. Overtraining can stall progress. And shorten or skip a run to recharge and maybe try a more fun route. Then some mindset tips. How to show up consistently. Focus on progress. Be guilt-free. Don't evaluate too much and take action. Visualize success and find accountability. And then the 3 attitudes to maintain throughout: patience, resilience, curiosity. Marathon training is about consistency, resilience, and trust in the process. By breaking your training into a structured, phased process, focusing on key workouts, and maintaining a flexible mindset, you'll not only complete your marathon, you'll enjoy the journey. Start with a plan, stick with it as much as you can, adapt where necessary, train smart, and let the finish line be the celebration of all your hard work. All right, we did it. Well done. You got all the way through. I'm impressed. I have to say those 2 episodes took more time to prepare and record than any of them. And I do put a decent amount of work into all of these, so it was a real shift. I think when I went into the idea that I had to do a sort of 2-part episode, or the initial idea was to do 1 part on how to train for a marathon and try and go through all of it. And when I started putting it all down on paper, I started to realize how much of a feat it really was and how much of an effort it was. So I really hope that you found those 2 episodes valuable. I hope that you are interested enough to maybe even return to them if you have found them that valuable, to try and remind yourself of some of the things that we covered. They will remain as a relic, and maybe if I did this in a few years' time, I would have a very different approach, but who knows? All I can say is I hope they were valuable, they were fun to make, fun to record, and there we have it. So, we are at that stage of the episode where we do listener questions. This is a segment of each episode where we take in questions from you. They might be just topics that you want discussed. They might be specific questions for something specific that you're going through. But you can go to the description below, go to the show notes and record your own. If you hit submit a question, a little browser will come up and prompt you to record a voice note of your own. So you can do that and we'll get through them. The next episode will be entirely dedicated to this. It'll be a Q&A where we'll go through far more. So I look forward to cracking through a few more of these questions because we've had an influx of questions recently, which is great. I love it. And I'm trying to get through all of them. I want to get through as much of it as I can. So without further ado, let's have a few questions. And the first one is from, do you know what? I'm not even going to pretend I haven't checked. I haven't listened to them. So who wants to go first?
Hi, Tommy. It's Jake from Leicester here. Really love the podcast. Really love the Instagram posts. But my question for you is around the topic of obsession. I think that many runners, myself included, experience a sense of guilt or even obsessiveness around their running routines, especially when they miss a workout. I know I certainly do. Just wondering, what are your views on balancing the mental health benefits of running with the risk of becoming overly reliant on it? How can we as runners find that healthy relationship that supports the goals that we want to achieve, but avoids guilt when we do need to take a break or when we miss a workout because of work commitments, whatever it may be? Apologies, maybe a bit of a deep question, I don't know, but keen to get your thoughts on it. Thanks, Tommy.
Oh, Jake, take a bow. What a question. Such a good question. I've just decided just now that I'm going to dedicate an entire episode to this question. I just think it's such a good one. I think we could cover such great ground on this topic. So much to think about. And as I sit here, I'm a bit overwhelmed with how much I reckon I could say on this topic. But I'm going to see what comes to mind. On Instagram, there's a lot out there that's all about one particular topic. Each page will be about one particular topic. And so it's easy to think that you should be as obsessed as it might seem others are. So there's the first point. Instagram doesn't give a total reality. It doesn't give a complete picture of what someone is like and how truly obsessed they are with it. I, for example, am someone who is into a lot of different things, but my Instagram is just about running. And of course I am, quote unquote, obsessed with running. It is my great interest. But I'm also obsessed with other things. Running happens to just be that one thing that I've decided to go all in on. It's the thing that has the most benefit in my life. And I think it's probably the most helpful to others. So it's what I've made an Instagram and TikTok and podcast about. And it's what I'm dedicating myself to. But there's a lot more outside of running that I invest my time in. So park that for a second. There's a lot more you can prioritize in your life outside of running. But we do often, some of us anyway, can fall into a trap, and there's a lot of people that can fall into a trap of being too obsessed, being too obsessive with their running. And like anything, we can be addicted to anything. And I think being addicted and reliant upon something, anything, is a bad thing. So you don't want to become too obsessed. And it's always important to constantly question yourself about how emotionally you're reacting to things. If you're emotionally reacting to a bad result or a bad workout and it's affecting your life in a deep way, in a negative way, then you should really have tough conversations with yourself, or necessary conversations with yourself, about how seriously you're taking it. Back in episode, whatever it was, one of the first episodes, maybe it was episode 2, I spoke specifically about not taking it too seriously, or taking running too seriously. It is something that's so important to me, and I think should be important to others. You're going to enjoy what you're doing far more if you take it less seriously. It's going to be more sustainable if you take it less seriously, and it's going to be more positive on your mental health. Taking all of this stuff too seriously and being too obsessed with it can really negatively impact your conscious experience of this life we have. And so it's important, however you want to approach it, to question your emotions, question how emotional you're getting about things, and keep tabs on it at all times. There are other things you can be doing with your time. Make sure you're interested in a real way in things outside of this. Make sure you're interested in a real way in things outside of this. It could be your family. It could be your work. It could be a different hobby. It could be cooking. There are other things to be fascinated by and curious by that can recharge your love for something that's important to you, like running. If you focus all of your energy and all of your attention on this one thing, it's possible that you will become too obsessed and that you will ruin your relationship with it. So make sure, if you're into going to gigs, you're obsessed with finding gigs and going to gigs. That's what I'm like. If you want to buy some vinyls and you're really excited about the new vinyl you get, I'm speaking about my own personal experience. If you want to be passionate about your relationship or your family, there is so much more that you can get involved with in a real way and be passionate about and fall in love with outside of your running. And I think that's only going to help form a healthy relationship with that one thing. So recognize that what you see on social media is just one part of a person. They might seem obsessed with it. That might create expectations on yourself to be equally as obsessed with these things. There are other things outside of running that they're doing. If you are getting very emotional about your running, if you're getting too obsessed, keep tabs on your relationship with it in that way, and make sure to spend as much time as you can on the other things that interest you, on the other things that provide value in your life. This podcast might be all about running, but life isn't. Thanks so much, Jake. That's a great question, and I hope my ramblings have been good enough as an initial answer, because I reckon we can do a whole episode on balancing obsession and the impacts of your mental health with obsessing too much and all that good stuff. So keep it for that. Appreciate the question, man. Okay, next up.
Hi, Tommy. Will here from South England, Bournemouth. Just a question on frequency and volume. I feel like I've plateaued a bit and I'm struggling to get above sort of 20 kilometres a week at the moment. Would you look at increasing your longer runs that I'm doing sort of once a week? Or would you look at increasing the frequency? So I'm currently running twice a week, one short, easy-ish run, maybe the odd sort of interval, hilly sprint session, and one long run. And would you look at increasing the long run every week? Or would you increase the total sort of runs a week, maybe go up to 3 runs a week and increase the distance that way? Thank you. Appreciate the response, and keep it up with the podcast.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate your question. And the answer is frequency. You need to make sure to first build your frequency, then your volume, then the intensity. Throwing in some intensity in there. So if you're already doing 20k a week on only 2 runs, I would definitely say divide that into 3, if not 4 runs, and then start increasing the distances of each. And only then would you be able to actually increase the long run to something more like 15k. I would hazard a guess that you don't have much time, or you feel like you don't have much time on your hands to add more runs, you don't necessarily need to be adding more time overall on your training. You can start just by splitting up the time you're spending out running. It might be 2 hours currently to 4 30-minute runs, if that makes sense. And then you can start increasing each. And you want to basically structure it so that you have 4 or 5 runs in there, 2 sort of recovery easy runs, or 3 easy runs, a medium run and a long run. And then you can start throwing in some intensity. So yeah, the short answer is I would definitely increase the number of times you're running per week, make them shorter runs, build that out to 4 or 5 times a week, and then start increasing your distance and your volume, and 100% you will exceed your current plateau. Thanks, Will. Hope that helps. Okay, I know this is a long episode, so we'll do one more and then we'll leave it for next week's Q&A.
Hi, Tommy. My name is Chandra. I am a South African young lady. I am married for like 3 years now. In the last 2 months, I decided to start running. I absolutely enjoy it. And last night, I did my first ever 10 kilometers run. I was crying from excitement. And one of the big reasons why I enjoyed running is because of your Instagrams. So this isn't per se a question. This is just a thank you from the bottom of my heart for helping me realize that running doesn't have to be what Instagram influence tell you to be. It's what you make it and how you feel when you're doing it. And it can be anything you want it to be, boring or, relaxing or challenging. And yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you. Your Instagram is amazing. And I love your podcast. Thanks so much.
Aw, I've got my bottom lip out. That's made me very happy. What an amazing thing to be a part of. I mean, one of my real goals is to try and help people find running. And you summarized it better than I could. The whole approach to this stuff needs to be personal. You need to approach it individually and first focus on enjoying it. And you're doing something right there by enjoying it, by feeling ecstatic about that 10K goal. And that is the first step. And I really believe if you keep going with that attitude and make sure you focus on the right things and the right reasons why you're doing it, you'll go far and you'll keep it in your life for a very long time. That's what this is all about, people. That is it. It's about approaching this stuff in the right way. It can be anything you want it to be. It can just be a respite from the day. It can be something that you want to take really seriously in a good way and train for a marathon or an ultra marathon or something huge that's years down the line. Whatever it is, you can approach it however you want. And no matter how you approach it, it will have value in your life. I strongly believe that. Thanks so much for the question. And yeah, makes me feel very happy. Thanks, Chandra. Appreciate it. All right. What a beast of an episode that was, eh? Thanks so much for joining. Thanks for getting to the end of the podcast. If you're still out running, good on you. Keep pounding away. Well done on working on yourself. Remember to check out the show notes. There's a few links in there. Devil's Gulch is my 100 miler next year. It's my A race. If you want to join me, there's a little 10% discount. We can clink a beer the night before and maybe swap tails after. If you want to support financially and buy me a coffee, you can also do that. There's obviously no obligation to do that whatsoever. I really appreciate all the support that comes my way. This is still a self-funded podcast, and I want to make sure that I keep doing it and keep having fun with it with you guys. And so any support that comes my way, I'm really appreciative of. And that includes sharing it with your mates, leaving a review or a rating depending on the platform you're on, and just listening, really. So with that, thanks for listening. Run the runnable. Keep showing up for yourself. And I'll see you next time.